August 1945. A few days ago, the U.S. dropped 2 atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, now inside a conference room deep in the labyrinth of the newly inaugurated Pentagon. A group of military men, scientists, and political operatives are being told that in a surprise attack, hundreds of Soviet ballistic missiles carrying atom bombs have struck America, and millions are dead.
Okay, this is not alternate history. The briefing is about a potential future threat scenario, and the aim of this group is to work out how they can defend themselves or at least detect such an attack should it happen. The solution they come up with will accelerate the nuclear arms race, revolutionize global communication, and mark the beginning of the space age. Only 4 months later.
Welcome to Season 1 of TimeGhost Cold War coverage in our series War to War, where we follow the wars that wouldn't end within a Cold World War, the beginning of the digital age, atomic age, and the space age, when we began to replicate our minds electronically, gained the power to end our very existence as a species, and discovered that we can truly reach for the stars. I'm Spartacus Olsson.
I'm Astrid Deinhard.
You know that I'd take down the moon for you, right, honey?
Would you? Oh, that's very sweet. But to do that, you'd have to know where the moon is at that time and how far away.
Right, and that's not so easy.
No, harder than you think. The moon is over 380,000 kilometers away from us and is constantly moving in relation to the Earth in 3 dimensions. It's also in outer space, far from our atmosphere. Well,
how about using radar, like on a ship?
Yes, perhaps, but the radio signals would have to penetrate the ionosphere, the layers at the upper end of the atmosphere that stretch into actual space located between 48 and 965 kilometers above the planet. That layer has a high concentration of ions and free electrons and is able to reflect radio waves. It's an essential part of the magnetosphere that protects our atmosphere from being literally blown away by cosmic and solar radiation and the solar winds. In fact, it's created when solar radiation and UV light ionize the particles in it.
Right. In 1945, it's even unclear if it's possible to send a radio wave through that layer. And even if it is possible, how will the radio waves behave? Moreover, if you do manage to hit the moon, will the returning echo penetrate? But if you want to detect an object inside or outside the ionosphere, like a ballistic missile launched into space to return to Earth with its payload, you have to succeed or detection will come too late for you to respond.
Yep. And when that meeting takes place at the Pentagon, 2 essential things are known. 1, atom bombs work and could be loaded on a ballistic missile. 2, rockets can go into space.
The previous year, on June 20th, 1944, the Nazi Germans tested the MW-18014 rocket, an A-4 ballistic missile, better known as the V2. MW-18014 reached an apogee of 176 kilometers, which is way higher than the lowest point that counts as outer space, later defined as the Kármán line, and agreed to be at an altitude of 100 kilometers.
Now, if you have been following our World War II coverage, especially Spies and Ties, you will know that the Americans and the Soviets have laid their hands on the Nazi German rocket and ballistic missile program. Both countries now have a team of German and national scientists working on developing even better systems to deliver an explosive payload to the enemy. It's obvious to both sides that this payload may soon be a nuclear warhead and that these missiles could eventually be launched from continent to continent.
in August 45, any practical application on that level is far away. There are no tangible signs of direct conflict between the USSR and the US. Nevertheless, a few cautious minds are thinking ahead. To them, it's not a question of if, but when the Soviets gained these capabilities. Moreover, they are seeing signs of geopolitical and ideological strife with the still ally, possibly very soon.
The leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin's behavior at Yalta in February left no doubt about his geopolitical ambitions to expand his sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Although the great revelations of Soviet infiltration with Gusenko and Bentley defections are still months away, the intelligence that has started dripping in leaves no doubt. The Soviets are preparing for a potential war with what they call the capitalist West.
Conversely, the Kremlin, especially Stalin, are convinced that the Western countries are hell-bent on destroying the USSR and communism. While this is an exaggerated fear, if not even paranoia, Western actions all the way back since the Russian Revolution 3 decades earlier seem to confirm the threat. In either case, now it becomes a quasi-self-fulfilling prophecy as the Western response to Stalin's plans is to also start preparing for a potential new war.
These preparations are for a war fought in the air, and while both sides have done progress in developing their aeronautical industry, they have failed to see the potential danger and possibly advantage of rocketry. Then came the German rockets in 1944, igniting a sudden political and military interest in space, both in Washington and Moscow.
You see, until then, the idea of sending things into space, let alone traveling into space, has largely been a topic of science fiction and scientists on the academic fringe. In the Soviet Union, there were active programs in the field in the 1920s. These went back to Tsarist times, and Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, a self-taught school teacher who published works on rocketry and space exploration, including exploration of the universe with rocket-propelled vehicles.
In 1903, Tsiolkovsky's work included complex mathematical analysis, most notably proposing the use of liquid propellant rockets for high altitude and outer space travel. He also formulated the Tsiolkovsky equation, dealing with the relationship between rocket size, propellant mass, and cargo capacity, right? Yes.
Besides Tsiolkovsky, Yuri Kondratyuk also played a significant role. He described minimum energy spaceflight trajectories, multi-stage rockets, interplanetary refueling bases, and atmospheric drag for planetary landings. He also formulated a lunar landing mission profile using separate vehicles.
But these ideas received little attention due to their mathematical complexity and the Tsarist government's disinterest. Then, after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the Soviet leadership showed some interest in Tsiolkovsky's idea, and he was elected to the Russian Socialist Academy and granted a lifetime pension for his contributions. That was good for him, right?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Although some practical tests were then carried out, by the late 1930s, interest declined as the Soviet government reduced support for such technologies. Mainly because the Artillery Directorate felt that liquid propellant missile research was not a useful military research. While solid propellant rockets were developed during the war, for instance for the Katyushka or Stalin organ, no major work on long-range ballistic missiles took place.
In the US, although one man was ahead of the world in this area, overall the Americans were even further behind. That man was Robert Goddard, physicist and professor at Clark University, Worcester.
Fascinated by the potential of rocket propulsion from an early age, in his small laboratory, he was the first to prove that thrust and propulsion can take place in a vacuum without any air to push back on. He also pioneered the mathematical calculation for the ratios of energy and thrust per weight of various fuels, including liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen.
In 1925, he developed a functional rocket motor using liquid oxygen and gasoline. On March 6, 16th, 1926, he launched the world's first flight of a liquid-propelled rocket. Listen, on his Aunt Effie's farm in Auburn, Massachusetts. It was mainly Goddard's finding and achievements that Werner von Braun and Generalmajor Walter Dornberger later used as basis for their development of the German A4 rocket.
In the U.S. itself, though, Goddard was met by ridicule in the press, and the U.S. government took little interest in his work. They had bigger fish to fry. You see, back in 1915, despite the U.S. being the cradle of propelled flight through the Wright brothers a decade earlier, the Americans had fallen behind in aeronautics.
The leaders were in Europe, and with Europe at war, no government expenses were being spared to develop better, more dangerous warplanes. Any development in the U.S., on the other hand, was being carried out by private interests without any coordination. With potential entry into the war lying ahead, this became an area of concern for the U.S. military and administration, of course.
To fix that, they founded the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. Now, the NACA was established to supervise and direct the scientific study of the problems of flight with a view to their practical solution. The more theoretical and distant possibilities of spaceflight were not within their scope. The theoretical underpinnings of aeronautical research rested with universities and European laboratories. That is how things remained all the way up to 1945.
Then, with a woof and bang in Peenemünde, things changed. When the German research and science starts coming back in 1945, the NACA immediately see the potential and react by creating the Pilotless Aircraft Research Division that's called PARD, and that was on July the 4th.
They also opened the Wallops Flight Center to continue development on the captured German A4 technology. In parallel, the U.S. Army begins testing of the A4 rockets at the White Sands Proving Grounds in New Mexico. After a few initial launches in 1945, in 1946 during Operation Hermes, they launched 25 A4 rockets in rapid succession, further solidifying the viability of ballistic missiles as payload delivery vehicles.
With all that in mind, it is little wonder that they assume that the Soviets are pursuing the same strategy, of course. The initiative to work out how to potentially detect and counter a Soviet attack comes already in August 1945, when the War Department asked the Signal Corps Evans Signal Laboratory to see if radar is the route for detection.
Now, the assumption that the Soviets are at the same stage is not quite correct. Yes, Stalin makes rocket and missile development a national priority by decree on 13th of May 1946. To act on that, Scientific Research Institute number 88, NII 88, is created under the military control of Dmitry Ustinov, who gathers the team to recover the German missile program. He appoints aeronautics engineer Sergei Korolev as head of the research into long-range ballistic missiles.
However, key to making any of their research a practical reality is to have the engagement of the Soviet aeronautical industry. That is under the helm of Alexei Shahurin, Minister of Aviation Industry, and whatever Stalin decrees, Shahurin doesn't believe that missiles are the future. Instead, he continues to dedicate all the money and power towards developing new bombers and fighters, also using rocket and jet propulsion, research and manpower captured from where from? From Germany. So, while the US makes a quick turn towards space in 1945 and 1946, the Soviet space program is a bit stuck, at least for now.
Be that as it may, the Americans see a threat, and in September 1945 they begin preparing Project Diana under leadership of John H. DeWitt Jr., the laboratory director at Evans. In absence of any satellites or missiles flying around, they choose the moon as their target to detect.
They take a wartime long-range radar of the type SCR/2 271 from 1937 and built it out from a 3 kilowatt power output to 50 kilowatts. So they then connect that to a high gain antenna to boost the effective radiation to approximately 10 megawatts, hoping that this will be enough to get through the ionosphere.
For the receiver, they use a multiple of 34 tubes and 4 intermediate frequencies to achieve a very sensitive system down to 0.01 microvolts attached to an oscilloscope. They tried several times in early January to run tests, but each time they experience equipment failures. On January 10th, 1946, they're ready to run another test. On that day, moonrise is at 11:48 a.m., and they transmit the first radar pulses as soon as she has risen. DeWitt is not present. I was over in Belmar having lunch and picking up some items like cigarettes at the drugstore.
The first signals are detected on the oscilloscope at 11:58 a.m. and the experiment is concluded at 12:09 p.m. when the moon moves out of the radar range. The radio waves have taken about 2.5 seconds to travel from New Jersey to the moon and back, a distance over 800,000 kilometers. To confirm beyond any doubt that they have succeeded, the experiment is repeated daily over the next 3 days and on 8 more days later in the month.
But the War Department want a peer review and withhold any announcement. DeWitt will recall. We had trouble with General Van Duysen, our head of R&D in Washington. The general did not want the story released until it was confirmed by outsiders for fear it would embarrass the Signal Corps. So, the general arrives with 2 outsiders from the radiation laboratory. As the moon rises, the team transmits. Nothing happens on the oscilloscope. DeWitt explains. You can imagine at this point I was dying. Shortly, a big truck passed by on the road next to the equipment, and immediately the echoes popped up. I will always believe that one of the crystals was not oscillating until it was shaken up, or that there was a loose connection which fixed itself. Everyone cheered, except the general, who tried to look pleased.
It is confirmed that they have achieved the first Earth-to-Moon interplanetary circuit and broke all records of long-distance radio transmission. On January the 28th, it's announced to the world, with the War Department predicting that this will enable the accurate topographical mapping of the moon and planets, measurements and analysis of the ionosphere, and radio control from Earth of spaceships and jet or rocket-controlled missiles circling the Earth above the stratosphere.
Soon the news hits the U.S. popular press. Most reactions and comments are positive, except Newsweek, who cast doubt on the experiment and cynically say that the predictions are fantasies worthy of Jules Verne. They are deeply mistaken. Every one of the predictions will come true. The world has taken the first technological step that will allow humanity to boldly go where no one has gone before and potentially destroy ourselves with a push of a button.
There you go.
The space age has begun.
We will continue to cover the events of the decade that brought men from the brink of destruction to the threshold of the stars. 1/4 of 1 year every week for the rest of 2025, right here at the TimeGhost channel.
To be an integral part of this great adventure, join the TimeGhost Army. It is that army that enables all of our creations. Excelsior!